It is the 14th of May, 1916, somewhere along a shattered ridge above the Ancre Valley in northern France. A British soldier lies motionless in a shell hole that has not moved, spoken, or so much as twitched for 6 hours. To the German observers scanning the wasteland through field glasses, there's nothing here but churned earth, splintered fence posts, and the ordinary debris of a battlefield that has already claimed tens of thousands of lives. What they cannot see is the man himself. He is wrapped from head to boot in a shapeless mass of sacking, netting, and irregular strips of dyed burlap, scavenged grass tucked into loops across his shoulders, his rifle wrapped in the same ragged material as his body. He does not look like a soldier. He barely looks human. He looks like the ground itself has grown a lump. And that, precisely, is the point. This is the Ghillie suit, and by any reasonable standard of military tailoring, it is an absurd garment. It has no rank markings, no smart lines, nothing that would pass inspection on a parade ground. Officers elsewhere in the army might have looked at it and laughed. But within the hour, that shapeless heap of rags will put a single round through a German officer's chest from 400 meters away, and the men around that officer will spend the rest of the afternoon firing wildly at hedgerows, fence posts, and shadows, utterly unable to work out where the shot came from. The suit that looked ridiculous on the quartermaster's table had just done something no smart uniform ever could. It had made a man disappear. By the war's end, tactics built around this scruffy invention would be credited, in the accounts of the men who wore it and the units who trained others to make it, with saving the lives of countless British and Allied soldiers, not by killing more efficiently, but by allowing a small number of highly trained marksmen to dominate stretches of no man's land that would otherwise have cost dozens of lives to hold. This is the story of how a piece of Highland gamekeeper's fieldcraft became one of the strangest and most effective pieces of protective equipment ever issued by the British Army, and why, more than a century later, it is still standing between soldiers and death on battlefields around the world. To understand why the Ghillie suit mattered, you first have to understand just how badly the British Army needed it. When war broke out in August 1914, the British soldier went to France dressed in a uniform designed for visibility and discipline, not concealment. Khaki drab had replaced scarlet only a decade earlier, following the bloody lessons of the Boer War, but khaki alone was never going to solve the deeper problem that trench warfare was about to expose. The First World War did not move. Armies dug in, faced each other across a few hundred meters of cratered ground, and stayed there, sometimes for years, staring at the same stretch of mud through binoculars and periscopes. In that kind of war, a single well-placed enemy rifleman could pin down an entire company for days. The Germans understood this faster than anyone. By early 1915, German industry was producing telescopic sights in bulk and training dedicated marksmen to use them, drawing on a strong civilian tradition of hunting rifles fitted with optics for stalking deer and boar in the Black Forest and the Bavarian Alps. British and French troops began suffering casualties from an enemy they frequently could not even locate. Soldiers were shot through loopholes they thought were concealed, through periscope slits, through the narrowest gaps in sandbagged parapets. Some regiments reported losing several men a day to a single hidden shooter, and morale suffered badly. It is one thing to be shelled. Shelling is impersonal and indiscriminate. It is another thing entirely to know that an individual man, somewhere out there, is watching you specifically and waiting for you to make a mistake. The British response initially was hopeless. Standard-issue rifles lacked telescopic sights almost entirely. There was no organized sniper training, no doctrine, no equipment, and worse, no real concept of what modern marksmanship required. Soldiers sent forward to counter German snipers were often just good shots handed a standard rifle and told to have a go, with predictably poor results. The problem was not marksmanship alone. It was concealment. A man who can shoot brilliantly is useless if the enemy can see him first, and the open, flat, cratered landscape of the Western Front offered almost nothing to hide behind. Uniforms that had looked serviceable on a parade ground in Aldershot were a liability the moment a man tried to lie still in a shell hole for half a day. The khaki stood out against churned brown earth and green grass alike. Buttons caught the light. Webbing created hard, unnatural lines against a landscape made entirely of soft, irregular shapes. Something had to change, and it had to change fast, because men were dying for the lack of it. The answer came not from a government laboratory or a weapons factory, but from the Scottish Highlands, and specifically from the community of gamekeepers, deer stalkers, and estate ghillies who had spent generations perfecting the art of getting close to wary animals without being seen. A ghillie, in the original sense of the word, was a gamekeeper's assistant on a Highland estate, someone whose entire professional skill rested on moving invisibly through open moorland to guide hunting parties within range of red deer that could detect the slightest unnatural movement from hundreds of meters away. These men had developed loose, ragged garments covered in strips of cloth and natural material specifically to break up the human silhouette, allowing them to crawl for hours across open hillside without startling animals whose survival depended on spotting exactly that kind of threat. The man usually credited with bringing this tradition into the British Army was Simon Fraser, the 16th Lord Lovat, who had raised a regiment called the Lovat Scouts during the Second Boer War in South Africa at the turn of the century, recruiting heavily from stalkers, gamekeepers, and estate workers on his own Highland lands and those of neighboring landowners. These men already understood fieldcraft at a level the regular army had never systematized: how to read wind and terrain, how to move without silhouette, how to lie motionless for hours while insects crawled across exposed skin, and, crucially, how to dress for invisibility rather than uniformity. When the Lovat Scouts were reconstituted and expanded for the First World War, they brought this Highland stalking tradition directly onto the Western Front, and in 1916 the regiment was formally tasked with training snipers and observers for the wider army, becoming in effect Britain's first dedicated sniper school. The garment itself, once formalized, was a masterpiece of deliberate untidiness. A base layer, usually a net or hessian-based smock, was covered with irregular strips of dyed burlap, jute, and scrim netting in mottled shades of brown, green, and gray, chosen to match the specific ground the wearer expected to occupy rather than any fixed pattern. Loose foliage, grass, and twigs could be woven directly into the netting and refreshed as the wearer moved between locations. So the suit was never quite finished. It evolved constantly to match its surroundings. Crucially, the strips were long and loose enough to move slightly in the wind, mimicking the natural movement of grass and undergrowth rather than presenting the rigid, still outline that the human eye is evolutionarily primed to notice instantly. Weight varied depending on materials to hand, but a fully dressed suit with a working rifle wrap could add several kilograms to a man's kit, roughly equivalent to carrying an extra sandbag draped across the shoulders, a real physical burden for a man who might need to crawl on his stomach for 200 meters before dawn. Manufacture was almost entirely improvised rather than centrally produced. There was no Ghillie suit factory turning out standard patterns. Sniper sections made their own, adapting Hessian sacking, camouflage netting issued for other purposes, and whatever local vegetation was available. Training at the Lovat Scouts sniping school and later at similar establishments taught men not just how to build the suit but how to move in it, how to select firing positions with a clear line of retreat, and how to remain still enough that heart rate and breathing themselves did not betray a position to a patient observer. Because production was so decentralized and dependent on local improvisation, no reliable figures exist for how many were made during the war, and any specific number quoted with confidence should be treated with real skepticism. What survives are training manuals, veteran accounts, and the outsized reputation the technique earned within the Army. The operational record, though patchy in places due to the informal and often unrecorded nature of individual sniping actions, is nonetheless striking. Lovat scouts and men trained in their methods were deployed across French and Belgian sectors from 1916 onwards, frequently working in pairs, one man shooting while the other observed through a spotting scope and corrected fall of shot. Accounts from the Somme sector describe positions held for entire days by a single hidden marksman able to suppress German movement across an entire stretch of trench line, a task that would otherwise have required an active fighting patrol, risking multiple casualties. German accounts from the period increasingly complained of an invisible enemy, unable to locate the source of fire even after repeated observation of the same ground. A psychological pressure that several regimental histories credit with slowing German trench maintenance and observation activity in contested sectors. It is worth being honest, though, that individual claims of enemy soldiers killed by named snipers during this period are difficult to verify independently and were sometimes inflated in post-war accounts. So this description focuses on the documented tactical effect rather than any specific tally of casualties inflicted. If you're finding the story of this scruffy, unglamorous invention as interesting as I do, a quick subscribe really does help more than you'd think. Germany, for all its early lead in telescopic sights and trained marksmen, never developed an equivalent culture of full-body concealment to the same degree during the First World War. German snipers relied heavily on fixed, camouflaged loopholes and armored steel plates set into the trench parapet, an approach that offered excellent protection from return fire but sacrificed mobility entirely. Once a German loophole position was identified, whether through muzzle flash, dust kicked up by the shot, or careful counter-observation, it could be targeted methodically by artillery or a waiting counter-sniper. The Lovat Scout's method, crawling into a temporary position, taking a shot and relocating before return fire could be organized, traded some individual protection for near-total unpredictability, which proved the harder problem for the enemy to solve. American forces, entering the war in 1917 with almost no organized sniper doctrine of their own, drew directly on British and French training establishments, and it is through this route, along with later exposure during the Second World War and Korea, that American forces adopted and eventually refined their own version of the technique, though the term ghillie suit itself, and much of the underlying philosophy of matching a garment to its specific terrain rather than issuing a fixed pattern, remained rooted in that original Highland stalking tradition. The genuine historical impact of the ghillie suit is best understood as overwhelmingly psychological and tactical, rather than measured in any dramatic body count, and it would be dishonest to claim otherwise given how incomplete wartime sniping records are. What is well documented is the disproportionate effect a small number of trained, properly concealed marksmen could have on enemy behavior across an entire sector, forcing troops to avoid movement in daylight, slowing repair and resupply work, and eroding morale in ways that conventional infantry actions rarely achieved with so few men committed. The technique's real legacy lies less in the First World War itself and more in what came after. The Lovat Scouts sniping school effectively created the doctrinal foundation for organized British Army sniper training that persists to this day, and the ghillie suit passed almost unchanged in principle, if not always in exact materials, into the Second World War, into Korea, into Vietnam with American forces, and into every conflict since where a small number of highly skilled marksmen have needed to dominate ground that a whole platoon could not safely hold. Surviving examples and related equipment can be seen today in the collections of the Imperial War Museum in London and in regimental museums connected to Highland regiments, alongside training manuals that still bear a striking resemblance to modern sniper school curricula used by armies across the world. So return for a moment to that shell hole above the Ancre, to the shapeless lump of sacking and grass that a German officer's own men could not distinguish from the ruined earth around it. It looked ridiculous. It would have looked ridiculous on any parade ground in the British Empire, and any sergeant major given the chance would have had it burned on sight. But war does not reward what looks impressive. War rewards what works, and this shapeless, scruffy, entirely unmilitary garment worked in a way that smart uniforms, fixed loopholes, and armored plate never could. It did not protect a man by stopping bullets. It protected him by making sure the enemy never knew where to aim in the first place, and in doing so, it protected the dozens of other soldiers who would otherwise have been sent forward to do by force what one hidden man could do by patience alone. A century later, the descendants of that same ragged Highland stalking suit still lie motionless in fields, deserts, and forests on active battlefields, still built by hand, still shaped to match the exact patch of ground a soldier expects to occupy, still looking to anyone who stumbles across one like nothing more than a lump of unremarkable scrub. It remains, in the truest sense, a uniform designed to disappear. And in a war fought across the flattest, most exposed ground imaginable, disappearing was worth more than any amount of gold braid or parade ground polish ever could be,